I once heard a warning whispered by a tired rancher at the edge of Red Canyon. If a masked Apache warrior stops you on that trail, do not laugh, because every man who laughed ended up learning respect. The desert wind carried dust across the canyon floor as Ethan Cole guided his horse slowly along the narrow trail. The red cliffs rising more than 300 feet above him on both sides like silent stone walls watching his journey. The late afternoon sun burned low across the western horizon, stretching long shadows across the sand and painting the canyon in deep copper light. Ethan had ridden nearly 20 miles since sunrise, and the quiet rhythm of the trail usually cleared his mind. But today something felt different in the air, as if the canyon itself were waiting for something to happen. Earlier that morning, a trader in the last town before the desert had leaned across the wooden counter and spoken quietly. "There is a warrior in that canyon," the man had said, his voice low enough that the others in the room could not hear. "A masked Apache who challenges every stranger who rides through that pass." Ethan had simply nodded at the time, not the kind of man to chase rumors. But the trader's eyes had carried a seriousness that lingered in his thoughts long after he rode away. Now, as the canyon narrowed and the wind shifted through the rocks, Ethan slowed his horse and listened. The only sounds were the soft steps of hooves on sand and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the cliffs. Then something moved on the ridge ahead. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow shifting along the stone, but Ethan's sharp eyes quickly focused on the shape standing against the sky. A figure stood there, tall and still, watching him from the edge of the canyon wall, nearly 40 feet above the trail. The rider pulled gently on the reins, and his horse stopped, its ears lifting toward the figure as well. The stranger wore dark leather armor and a carved warrior helmet that hid the face completely, the shape of it catching the fading sunlight in sharp angles. The wind moved across the ridge, lifting strands of dark fabric behind the warrior's shoulders. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Ethan studied the stance carefully. Whoever stood above him was balanced and steady, not a nervous fighter, but someone who knew exactly how to stand on that cliff without slipping a single inch. Slowly, the warrior raised one arm and pointed toward the narrow path that continued deeper into the canyon. The meaning of the gesture was clear even from that distance. If you wished to ride through Red Canyon, you would not pass quietly today. Ethan exhaled softly and swung one leg over the saddle, boots landing in the dust with a quiet thud. The wind moved again between the canyon walls as he looked up toward the silent figure on the ridge. Somewhere far above, the hawk circled once more across the glowing sky. And in that moment, Ethan Cole understood something the trader in town had not fully explained. This was not an ambush. This was a challenge waiting to begin. The masked warrior did not climb down right away. For several long moments, the figure remained on the ridge, standing against the burning red sky as the sun slid lower behind the canyon walls. The wind drifted slowly through the narrow pass, carrying fine dust across the trail and brushing against Ethan Cole's coat. Ethan rested one hand loosely on the saddle horn of his horse and kept his eyes on the figure above him. The rancher in town had been right about one thing. Whoever guarded this canyon had patience. And patience, Ethan knew, often meant confidence. Finally, the warrior moved. The descent down the ridge was careful and controlled, boots finding narrow stone ledges in a path that only someone familiar with the canyon would know. Within half a minute, the figure stepped onto the sand of the trail, roughly 20 feet from Ethan. The two of them stood facing each other with the canyon walls towering around them like a silent arena. The warrior's helmet hid every detail of the face beneath it, carved lines across the metal catching the last orange light of sunset. A dark cloth wrapped around the neck and shoulders, and leather armor protected the chest and arms. The stance was balanced, calm, and perfectly steady. Ethan noticed something else as well. The warrior's breathing was slow and even, the kind of breathing a person develops only after years of discipline. The wind lifted slightly, and pushed a loose strand of dust across the ground between them. Ethan removed his hat and brushed the dust from the brim before placing it back on his head. "I was told someone might stop me here," he said calmly, his voice carrying clearly through the still canyon air. The warrior did not answer. Instead, the figure stepped forward one pace and lifted a hand. The gesture was simple but unmistakable. "Palm forward. Stop." Ethan allowed a small, thoughtful smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "That is a long way to climb just to greet a traveler," he said. Again, the warrior remained silent. After a few seconds, the figure reached down and drew a short wooden training staff from a strap at the side. It was not a weapon meant to harm someone seriously. It was the kind of staff used in controlled sparring, balanced and smooth from careful use. The warrior planted one end lightly in the sand and tilted the helmet slightly toward Ethan. The message was clear even without a single word spoken. If Ethan wished to pass through Red Canyon, he would have to prove something first. Ethan studied the warrior carefully, taking in every detail of posture and movement. There was no anger in the stance, no wild challenge, only quiet certainty. Ethan slowly stepped away from his horse and rolled his shoulders once, as if preparing for a long ride rather than a contest. The canyon wind rose again and moved between the cliffs like a distant whisper. Ethan brushed the dust from his hands and looked directly at the masked face. "All right," he said calmly. "Let us see what this canyon wants to teach today." The masked warrior lifted the wooden staff from the sand and held it lightly across both hands, not in anger, but with the calm readiness of someone who had repeated the same ritual many times before. The canyon wind moved between the towering cliffs and carried a low whistle through the stone as the last edge of sunlight slipped behind the ridge. Ethan Cole stepped slowly away from his horse, boots pressing quietly into the soft dust of the trail. The air smelled of warm rock and dry desert grass. Neither of them rushed forward. Instead, they began to circle each other with careful steps, watching, measuring, learning. Ethan had spent many years on the frontier, and one thing he understood well was that the first moments of any contest revealed more than the rest. The warrior moved lightly across the sand, almost silently, shifting weight from one foot to the other with controlled balance. The helmet hid the face completely, but the body language spoke clearly. This was someone trained with patience. Ethan bent his knees slightly and raised his hands in a relaxed guard, his eyes focused on the staff, but also studying the warrior's shoulders and hips for the smallest signal of movement. The wind lifted a small spiral of dust between them and then faded again, leaving the canyon quiet except for the distant cry of the hawk still circling high above the cliffs. Suddenly, the warrior stepped forward with a quick motion of the staff, not striking but testing the distance between them. Ethan shifted his stance and stepped aside smoothly, the staff passing through empty air before returning to a balanced position. The movement had been fast, but it carried no wild force behind it. It felt more like a question than an attack. Ethan nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the test. "You move well," he said calmly. The warrior did not answer. Instead, the figure adjusted the grip on the staff and stepped again into the circle of sand where the fading sunlight still touched the ground. This time, Ethan noticed something unusual. The steps were precise, almost graceful, the kind of movement more often seen in practiced dance than in a rough desert fight. The staff moved again in a controlled sweep that forced Ethan to step back 2 paces, his boots sliding lightly through the sand as he avoided the motion. He felt a faint smile appear on his face despite the tension of the moment. Whoever stood behind that helmet was not trying to hurt him. They were studying him just as carefully as he was studying them. The two of them continued moving through the circle of dust while the canyon shadows slowly grew longer around them. Each motion revealed another small detail. The warrior's balance never broke. The breathing remained calm, and every movement carried an unusual rhythm that Ethan could not quite explain. After several minutes, he began to realize something that made him narrow his eyes with curiosity. The rumors in town had called this warrior dangerous, but what Ethan saw before him was something different. This was not a wild challenge from a reckless fighter. This was a test. And as the wind shifted once more through the canyon, Ethan Cole understood that the true question hidden inside that test had not yet been revealed. The circle of dust between them grew wider as the sun finally slipped behind the canyon ridge, leaving only a deep amber glow along the tops of the cliffs. The masked warrior moved again, the wooden staff turning smoothly through the air before stopping just short of Ethan Cole's shoulder. Ethan leaned slightly back and allowed the staff to pass, his boots shifting across the sand with calm control. The movement was quick but precise, and once again there was no reckless force behind it. The staff returned to a ready position as the warrior stepped away, maintaining the same quiet balance that had been present since the first moment on the trail. Ethan brushed a thin layer of dust from his sleeve and studied the figure more carefully now. Something about the rhythm of the warrior's movements continued to bother him, though he could not yet explain why. Every step was measured. Every turn flowed naturally into the next. Even the way the warrior adjusted the grip on the staff carried a certain elegance. Ethan had sparred with ranch hands, soldiers, and trail guards across many miles of frontier land, and most of them fought with strength first and balance second. This fighter moved differently. The warrior circled again and tested the distance, once more with a light sweep of the staff toward Ethan's side. Ethan stepped around it, raising one arm to guide the motion away without striking back. The two figures separated again by several feet of sand while the canyon wind whispered softly along the rock walls. For a few seconds they stood still, watching each other. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a quiet thought forming in the back of his mind. The warrior's breathing remained steady, but Ethan noticed a detail he had missed before. When the figure shifted weight from one foot to the other, the motion carried a smooth grace that did not belong to the rough fighting styles he had seen among traveling fighters. The steps were lighter, more controlled, almost careful. The wind rose again and lifted a curtain of dust along the canyon floor before settling back into silence. The hawk above finally drifted away from the canyon rim as the light continued to fade. Ethan slowly lowered his hands and allowed a small, thoughtful smile to appear on his face. "You are not trying to defeat me," he said calmly, his voice echoing faintly against the stone walls. "You are studying me." The warrior did not answer, but the helmet tilted slightly, as if acknowledging the observation. The staff lowered just a few inches, the gesture so subtle that many men might not have noticed it. Ethan took a slow step forward, careful and steady. The warrior did not retreat. Instead, the figure adjusted stance again, ready but calm. And in that quiet moment, Ethan realized the contest had never been about strength at all. It was about understanding who he was and what kind of man had entered this canyon. The desert wind moved once more between the cliffs as the sky darkened into deep violet above them. Ethan studied the masked face carefully and spoke again, softer this time. "All right," he said. "Now I am curious." The canyon had grown quieter as the last light faded from the sky, leaving only a dim silver glow along the high ridge where the moon had begun to rise. Ethan Cole stood calmly in the dust of the trail while the masked warrior remained several steps away, the wooden staff resting lightly in both hands. The wind moved slowly through the narrow pass, brushing against Ethan's coat and carrying the faint scent of dry stone and desert sage. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan had the strong feeling that the contest had already revealed more than it first appeared. The warrior had tested him again and again with quick movements of the staff, yet each motion had stopped just short of real harm. The pattern had been clear. Whoever stood behind that carved helmet was measuring his reactions rather than attempting to defeat him. Ethan lowered his hands slightly and studied the warrior with growing curiosity. The figure shifted weight once more, and this time Ethan noticed another small detail that had escaped him earlier. The stance was balanced, but the steps were lighter than those of most fighters he had known. Even the way the staff turned between the warrior's hands carried a careful precision that felt almost graceful. Ethan had spent years traveling across open plains and mountain passes, meeting soldiers, ranch guards, and skilled riders along the way. Most of them moved with heavy confidence, relying on strength or speed to overwhelm an opponent. This fighter moved with something different. It was discipline, certainly, but there was also a strange restraint, as though every motion had been carefully practiced to avoid unnecessary harm. The warrior lifted the staff again and stepped forward with another controlled sweep aimed toward Ethan's shoulder. Ethan reacted smoothly, guiding the motion away with one hand and stepping inside the circle of dust between them. For a brief second, the distance between them shrank to only a few feet. Ethan could hear the warrior's breathing through the narrow slits of the helmet. It was calm and steady, not the breathing of someone angry or desperate. The two figures separated again as the warrior stepped back, resetting the stance with the same quiet patience as before. Ethan brushed a layer of dust from his sleeve and allowed a thoughtful smile to form. Something about the entire encounter felt less like a battle and more like a conversation spoken through movement. The canyon wind rose slightly and stirred the sand at their feet while the moon climbed higher above the ridge. Ethan tilted his head and spoke again in a calm voice that carried easily through the still air. "You are careful," he said. "Most fighters I have met try to win quickly. You are not trying to win. You are trying to understand." The warrior remained silent, but the helmet turned slightly toward him as though listening closely. Ethan stepped forward once more, closing the space between them just enough to study the carved surface of the helmet more carefully. The design was simple but strong, shaped to hide the entire face beneath it. Yet something about the posture behind that mask felt different from the stories he had heard in town. Ethan let out a slow breath and narrowed his eyes slightly as the final pieces of his curiosity began to fall into place. The rumors had called this warrior dangerous, but now Ethan suspected the truth was far more interesting. And as the wind whispered through Red Canyon once again, he realized that whatever secret stood behind that helmet was waiting very close to the surface. "I think you already know something is hidden behind this mask," the warrior said quietly for the first time, the voice calm and steady as the canyon wind moved between the cliffs. Ethan Cole did not look surprised when he heard the words. He had suspected for several minutes that the contest had never been about defeating him. The moonlight now spread across the sand of the canyon floor, painting the rocks in pale silver while the last warmth of sunset disappeared beyond the ridge. Ethan stood only a few feet away from the masked figure, studying every small movement carefully. The warrior still held the wooden staff, but the stance had softened slightly, as if the test had reached its final moment. Ethan slowly extended one hand toward the staff and gently guided it aside without force. The warrior allowed the motion without resistance. For a brief second, they stood close enough to hear each other breathe. The desert was quiet except for the soft whisper of wind sliding along the canyon walls nearly 200 feet above them. Ethan spoke calmly. "I think this canyon is not testing my strength. I think it is testing my respect." The helmet tilted slightly as the warrior listened. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "Most fighters I have known would have tried to knock me down by now. You never tried. You only watched how I moved and how I reacted. That means you were not looking for the strongest man. You were looking for the right one." The warrior lowered the staff slowly until the tip touched the sand again. The moonlight reflected along the carved surface of the helmet, hiding the face beneath it completely. After a few seconds, the warrior took one careful step backward. Ethan noticed something else then. The movement was light, almost silent. Even the way the shoulders turned carried a grace that felt different from any fighter he had ever met. Ethan took a slow breath as the final piece of the mystery settled into place in his mind. Without speaking another word, he reached forward with calm hands and gently caught the edge of the helmet. The warrior did not stop him. The canyon wind rose softly at that exact moment, lifting dust from the trail and carrying it through the narrow pass like a quiet signal from the desert itself. Ethan lifted the helmet upward. The carved mask rose slowly into the moonlight. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then long black hair spilled free across the warrior's shoulders, moving lightly in the night wind like dark water flowing down the red canyon walls. Ethan froze. The stories in town had spoken of a feared Apache warrior who challenged every outsider. None of them had ever imagined this truth. Standing in front of him was not the man those travelers had described. It was a young Apache woman with steady eyes and calm strength in her expression. She looked directly at Ethan without fear, as if the mask had only hidden her face and never her confidence. The wooden staff rested quietly at her side, while the moonlight illuminated her features for the first time. The canyon seemed to grow even quieter around them as Ethan lowered the helmet slowly into his hands. The warrior who guarded Red Canyon had never been the legend the travelers believed. And in that silent moment beneath the wide desert sky, Ethan Cole realized that the true story of this canyon had only just begun. The helmet rested quietly in Ethan Cole's hands while the canyon wind moved through the narrow pass, lifting strands of the Apache woman's long black hair across her shoulders. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The moon had climbed higher above the canyon ridge, casting pale silver light across the sand and the tall red walls rising around them. Ethan looked at the woman standing in front of him, still holding the wooden staff with calm balance. There was no anger in her eyes and no embarrassment either. Only a steady confidence that seemed to belong to the canyon itself. Ethan slowly lowered the helmet and turned it slightly in his hands as if studying the carved lines along its surface. "So the stories were wrong," he said quietly. The woman watched him carefully before answering. "The stories are not wrong," she replied. "They are simply incomplete." Her voice was calm and clear, carrying easily through the still desert air. Ethan raised his eyes again and studied her expression more closely now that the mask no longer hid her face. "You are the one who stops travelers on this trail," he said. The woman nodded once. "Many men ride into Red Canyon believing they can take whatever they wish from the land. I ask them to show who they really are before they pass." Ethan allowed a faint smile to appear. "And if they fail your test?" The woman rested the staff lightly against the sand and answered without hesitation. "Then they turn around and ride back the way they came." Ethan glanced around the canyon walls towering more than 200 feet above them. The silence of the place made her words feel heavier somehow, as if the canyon itself were listening. He understood now why the rumors had spread across the towns beyond the desert. Travelers who returned with wounded pride often told their stories in exaggerated ways. A masked Apache warrior who defeated everyone sounded far more impressive than the truth. Ethan looked back at her and spoke again. "You never intended to hurt anyone, did you?" The woman shook her head slowly. "Strength alone does not show what kind of man someone is. But patience does. Respect does." The wind shifted again and carried a cool breath of night air through the canyon floor. Ethan noticed that the wooden staff in her hand was worn smooth from long practice. This had clearly been her ritual for many years. He set the helmet gently on the sand beside them and stepped back a few feet, giving her space again. "You could have kept the mask on," he said quietly. "Most men would never have questioned the legend." The woman looked toward the high canyon ridge where the moonlight touched the rock. "Legends protect a place for a while," she said softly. "But sometimes the truth must stand on its own." Ethan studied her in silence for another moment before speaking again. "And what happens now that I know the truth?" The woman lifted the staff slightly and rested it across her shoulders in a relaxed posture. "That depends," she replied calmly. "Do you intend to pass through this canyon as a stranger, or as someone who understands why it is protected?" The wind moved once more across the sand between them while the desert sky stretched wide above the silent canyon. Ethan Cole realized then that the challenge he had faced had never truly ended. It had only changed into something far more meaningful. The canyon remained silent after her question, the kind of silence that seems to stretch farther than the land itself. Ethan Cole stood still in the pale moonlight while the desert wind brushed gently across the sand between them. For a long moment, he did not answer. Instead, he looked around Red Canyon, as if seeing it for the first time. The cliffs rose high above them, their red stone glowing faintly under the silver sky. The narrow trail that had brought him there continued deeper into the canyon, like a quiet promise waiting to be understood. Ethan finally spoke in a calm voice. "I did not come here to take anything. I only came to pass through." The Apache woman watched him carefully, her dark eyes steady and thoughtful. "Many travelers say that when they first arrive," she replied softly, "but the desert has a way of revealing what men truly carry in their hearts." Ethan nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. The wind moved again through the canyon, lifting a thin ribbon of dust that drifted across the trail before settling again. He bent slightly and brushed the sand from the brim of his hat before placing it back on his head. Then he looked at her again. "If this canyon means that much to you," he said quietly, "then anyone who rides through it should understand why." The woman studied him for another moment, measuring his tone just as carefully as she had measured his movements during the test. The wooden staff rested loosely in her hand now, no longer held as a challenge. "Most men who reach this point are angry," she said. "They believe the test is an insult. They believe the land belongs to whoever rides through it with the strongest horse." Ethan allowed a small smile to appear. "Strength is easy to show," he replied. "Respect takes more patience." The moonlight reflected softly across the canyon walls as the night grew deeper. The hawk that had circled earlier in the evening had disappeared beyond the ridge, leaving the sky wide and quiet above them. The woman glanced toward the narrow trail leading deeper into Red Canyon. "My name is Ayanna," she said after a moment. Ethan nodded respectfully. "Ethan Cole." The two names settled into the quiet desert air as if they had been waiting there for years. Ayanna looked back at him again, and the calm strength in her posture softened slightly. "Few travelers listen long enough to learn the name of the person guarding this canyon," she said. Ethan glanced toward the helmet resting in the sand where he had set it earlier. "I think the canyon wanted me to see the truth instead of the legend." Ayanna followed his gaze to the helmet and then back to him. "Legends protect a place from a distance," she said gently, "but understanding protects it better." The wind rose once more and moved through the canyon floor, carrying the faint sound of Ethan's horse shifting patiently behind him on the trail. For a few quiet seconds, neither of them spoke again. Then Ayanna lifted the staff slightly and gestured toward the narrow path that continued between the towering cliffs. "If you ride deeper into Red Canyon now," she said, "you will do so knowing what this land asks from those who enter it." Ethan looked toward the trail and then back at her, realizing that the challenge he had faced was never meant to keep him out. It had only been meant to show him the kind of traveler he needed to become before the canyon would allow him to pass. The desert wind moved quietly through Red Canyon as Ethan Cole looked down the narrow trail that disappeared deeper between the towering cliffs. For a long moment he said nothing. The moonlight rested across the sand like pale silver dust while the night sky stretched wide and endless above them. Behind him his horse shifted softly and gave a calm breath into the cool air, the sound echoing faintly against the canyon walls nearly 200 feet high. Ethan turned back toward Ayanna and studied her with the same quiet focus she had used during the test. The wooden staff rested loosely in her hand now, no longer a challenge, but simply part of who she was. The carved helmet lay in the sand where he had set it earlier, its shadow stretching across the ground beside them. Ethan took a slow breath and spoke calmly. "I think the canyon already decided whether I belong here." Ayanna watched him carefully, the moonlight reflecting gently in her eyes. "The canyon does not decide for you," she replied. It only asks what kind of traveler you are. Ethan nodded once as if he had expected that answer. Then he walked a few steps toward the helmet and lifted it from the sand. The carved surface caught the moonlight again as he brushed the dust from it with one hand. Instead of handing it back immediately, he looked at it for a moment longer, as if acknowledging the legend that had lived inside it. Many men must have believed this mask meant power, he said quietly. Iana stepped closer and rested the staff lightly against the ground beside her. The mask allowed them to believe whatever story their pride needed, she answered. Ethan allowed a small, thoughtful smile. Pride often tells louder stories than truth. The wind drifted again through the canyon floor and lifted a soft swirl of sand around their boots before fading into silence. Ethan finally extended the helmet toward her. Iana accepted it slowly and held it against her side rather than placing it back on her head. For the first time since the encounter began, there was no barrier hiding her face. Ethan glanced toward the trail once more where the moonlight traced a pale path through the canyon. Then he turned back toward her. I will ride through Red Canyon tomorrow morning, he said. But tonight I will stay near the entrance and give the land time to rest. Iana studied him for a moment before nodding gently. That is a wise choice. The desert often speaks more clearly at sunrise. Ethan placed his hat firmly on his head and walked back to his horse, resting one hand against the saddle. He looked once more toward Iana, standing calmly in the moonlit canyon. Thank you for the test, he said quietly. Iana watched him with a calm expression that carried both strength and quiet respect. The canyon did not test you alone tonight, she replied. It reminded me that not every traveler comes here to conquer something. Ethan gave a small nod and led his horse slowly toward a flat patch of sand near the canyon entrance where he could rest until morning. Behind him, Iana remained standing in the moonlight, the staff resting against her shoulder while the helmet remained in her hand. The wind moved softly through Red Canyon again as the night settled deeper around them.